Thank you, Bob, for that introduction and actually a primer on what GitOps and the automation is all about. Right? So my name is Pratik Wadher. I actually run the Intuit developer platform. What I wanted to do here is actually talk about how do we reinforce and actually make real some of the concepts that Bob just highlighted, right? How do you actually do GitOps at scale using the technologies that are available and some of the technologies that we had to build along our journey, right? If you're not familiar with Intuit, Intuit is a company that is founded about 35 years ago. It has a lot of legacy stuff. It is in the financial and business management software. Some of the products that you may be familiar with: TurboTax, for those of you that file taxes; QuickBooks for small businesses; Mint for your personal finance, software. And as you can imagine, we are about 9,000 strong. We're in over 20 locations all over the globe, including San Diego, which is the home of TurboTax. And one of the things that we've been focused on is our journey over the years into cloud, right? So just about 4 years ago, the majority of our stack was actually in multiple data centers located throughout the US. And about 4 years ago, we built a strategic partnership with AWS and began our journey into the cloud, right? The primary goal of this journey was really to improve our developer velocity, product velocity, and essentially, reduce our dependence on our own data centers, right? And we started the journey with essentially a lift and shift method, right? So we took all the practices that we had in our data centers, we moved it to AWS, and we started to operate in AWS, right? And all seemed fine, right? One of the things that we started noticing, though, is that we weren't really getting the developer productivity that we wanted, right? The rate of innovation that we were striving to achieve, while it improved, it was much better. Developers did not have to worry about infrastructure or were not maybe exposed to infrastructure as much. They still, had to at least understand what was being deployed and what was going on. Right? The other two terms that, we constantly talk about at Intuit are MTTR, MTTD, which is mean time to recover, and mean time to detect, right? If you have something that goes wrong, how quickly can you detect that something is going wrong? And then how quickly can you fix it, right? And our hope was that as we moved into the cloud, that we would actually get better at these things, right? So what we were seeing is that, yes, we got better, but not by much, right? And so Intuit was actually experimenting with containers. And in 2018, they decided that they needed help. And so we acquired a company called Applatix. So I was the founder and CEO of Applatix. And I had been on a journey over the last 20 years working in a lot of startups. Every startup that I worked at, I had to reinvent the wheel in terms of how do we get developers to develop stuff fast? How do you get your product to market faster? And I was reinventing that wheel time and time again. And when containers came along and Kubernetes came along, we saw an opportunity to actually build a developer platform that would enable enterprises to move much faster. Right? So there we were, working on building these things, getting happily engaged with the Kubernetes community. Along comes Intuit and says, hey, we want to build something. And started a relationship which eventually transformed into Applatix getting acquired by Intuit. So over the last year and a half, what we've done is we've really accelerated the cloud journey and the container journey for Intuit. We've built a self-service, what we call a modern SaaS platform. And by the way, I love the name modern SaaS because what? It never gets old. It's always modern, right? So I have a number of people tell me, change the name, but I like it. Right? So, okay. And so along the way, what we've done is we've actually had to implement a number of things on this journey. We've actually had to invent a number of things in the open source community, right, to actually make our lives easier. Right? So what does Kubernetes mean at Intuit? Right? So Intuit is actually comprised of 4 business units. There's a small business unit, there's a consumer group, there's a professional services group, right? And then there's a central team which actually manages a lot of the central tools and services, right? Each business unit is comprised of many segments, right? So for example, our small business segment comprises payroll, payments, accounting, mobile, right? And we have over 5,000 developers, okay? So that's a huge developer community. That's a huge customer community that is sitting right in front of us and actually helping us and guiding us every single day. So one of the things that we've done, which is maybe a little unique, is if you look at Kubernetes deployments in general, a lot of deployments you'll see are structured along the notion of creating a large Kubernetes cluster. Right? You may see clusters, or you may hear of clusters of up to 4,000 nodes, 5,000 nodes. Right? We've taken a very different approach at Intuit because, as Bob talked about, we care about our blast radius very, very carefully. We have a lot of governance and compliance reasons, right? We are a financial services company. So what we've done is essentially structured it in a way that each business unit has a number of clusters. Typically, a business unit will have a pre-production cluster, a production cluster, a DR cluster, and then potentially a PCI compliance cluster. Right? What developers are exposed to is not a cluster. Developers actually never interact with a cluster, or a service owner never interacts with a cluster. What developers get is a namespace in Kubernetes. That's their blast radius. That's what they work out of. And we've had to automate a lot of things to actually make that easy for them to create a service, which is what I'll go into. Right? So going back to our developer velocity, one of the things that we have seen dramatically change is where we were doing releases every month, every 2 weeks, sometimes every quarter, we're doing about 1,300 deployments a day now. Right? So the release velocity, deployment velocity has gone up dramatically. Right? Okay. As part of this, we've of course had to develop a number of things and a number of tools. Okay. And the philosophy that we followed is that we will use open source wherever possible. We will contribute to the open source communities, or we will create communities where none exist. Okay. And as you can see, this is the rate of adoption that we've seen. We started with about 0 presence on Kubernetes about 1.5 years ago. We're up to over 2,000 services running in production. Okay. Our MTTR, mean time to recover, used to be about 45 minutes about 1.5 years ago. We're down to 5 minutes today. Okay. Deployment cycles, as you've seen, it's gone from days to minutes. Okay. And more importantly, in the life of a developer or service creation, creating a service, creating a new service, used to take days, sometimes used to take months, right? Remember, you have to create the service, create the clusters, you have to make sure that you have the right permissions, the right VPC peering, the right whitelisting. All of that has shrunk to 10 minutes. So a developer that wants to create a service will go from clicking a couple of screens and get a completely running application in a Kubernetes namespace with a deployment pipeline, with a build pipeline, right, in under 10 minutes. Okay. Of course, we make heavy use of a lot of open source projects. We contribute to a lot of open source projects, and I'll talk to you about some of them. Right. This actually was recognized by the CNCF. So we actually were recognized as the top end user for CNCF earlier this year at KubeCon Barcelona. So a little bit more about what this modern SaaS platform is about. Okay. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen slides which look like this, right? This is the entire DevOps suite or the suite of tools, or, and it's about any and every tool that a developer loves, right? And that was no different than what existed at Intuit, right? We love our tools. We love everything new. We want to try anything new that comes in. Right? So what we did is we said, OK, that's great, but we really wanted to have a curated environment. We want to make sure that we cohesively tie these things together so that as a developer, you do not need to worry about which tool to use, but all of these tools are configured to use right out of the box. Okay? So if you take a look at this, it's actually, at the bottom, you can see that it covers the entire spectrum, going from defining, building, deploying, and actually then running your service. And on the vertical side, what you see is the spectrum of what an application or a service needs to do, right? Starting with the top, which is the user experience, right? Talking about the different platforms that you may use. So for example, if you're an ML developer, then you need an ML platform, right? You need to make sure that there's an ML pipeline that you can create, right? So those are the different services and platforms that you need to create for the different sets of developers that exist in the company, right? Followed by the regular tools. You need a build tool. You need a deployment tool. You need a place to store your artifacts, right? You need to be able to log, monitor, get traces, right? So that is the stack that we have. It's all built on the core AWS infrastructure stack, followed by a Kubernetes service that we have created. And today it's a kops-based. So if you're familiar with, clusters and how do you create clusters, it's a kops-based cluster. We are rapidly migrating them into EKS as we speak. Okay. We have a lot of security and governance that's built into these things. So for example, we use, the OPA, the Open Policy Agent from Styra. Right? That is actually integral to the way we define and monitor our security and governance. Okay. Today at Intuit, for example, all of the traffic was north-south. Everything needs to go out through our gateway, come back in. Very inefficient, right? So we have now started to employ service mesh so we can actually route all our east-west traffic through Istio. Okay. As a result, we've started to contribute a lot of, of our learnings back into the Istio community. One of the things we found out is that, in order to have a multi-tenant solution for our service mesh, we needed to develop something which did not exist. So one of the projects that we have is a project called Admiral, which sits in the Istio landscape and allows you to do just that. Okay? So these are, it's a platform. You see a lot of tools that you may recognize. Some of the tools we've had to build. So for example, Argo workflows, the Argo CD. Those are actually projects that we've had to build and contribute back to the community to help us do some of these things. Okay. Right. So now, what I thought it'd be interesting to do is actually to show a demo, if the demo gods will agree. But it's a demo of actually what a developer at Intuit would go through. So we're going to create a service. We're going to deploy it. We're going to monitor it. We're going to manage it. So I'm going to start with what is called the Intuit Developer Portal. So any developer at Intuit usually starts here. This is where they would essentially utilize a service. They can create a service. They can get all the tools that they need. Okay? Typically, you would start here. And as I mentioned, there's various things you can do. You can, if you're a mobile or a front-end developer, you can create plugins, apps. If you're a service developer, and this is typically what we'll start with, let's create a service. Okay, so I would create it in my personal space here. I would give it a name. Just so that I don't get penalized by my team, right? Okay. I'm part of the Intuit developer platform. And enter a little thing here. I want to create it in the sandbox environment. Okay. And I hit continue. So the next thing that you see happening is we're going to start onboarding this service. And we typically provide what we call paved roads. So if you're building a Java service, if you're building a Node service, there's actually a Golang service, but not included here. But this is essentially the common services that we would create, or the common stacks that we would create. And the reason we do this is because it actually, what this onboarding does is it actually creates a live running deployment. It will deploy a sample service with all of the connections that you would need, tied in. Okay? Right? And what does it get you? It actually gets you 3 GitHub repos. So we talked about, what does it mean to be GitOps oriented? So when we onboard a service, we get 3 GitHub repos. We essentially get an application repo, a configuration repo for your service, and a deployment repo for your service. Okay? So I'm going to skip this because it takes about 10 minutes and go into what you will end up with once you start something. Okay? So here's a service that I created earlier. As you can see, it's a deployment. It's an AWS Container Day service. It actually has different environments: a production, a staging, an N2E, a qualification. Okay? It has 3 Git repos that it created for me. It created a build pipeline for me. And there's a folder in Artifactory to store my artifacts. Okay? If I look at the repos, this is my application repo. Nothing special there. This is my deployment repo, which has the environments that we just talked about. Again, nothing bad. These are all your Kubernetes YAMLs, deployment specs that generally exist. Okay? And this is what you would end up with as a user. You end up with a deployment repo and a config repo. Right? If you click on the build pipeline, you get a sample build pipeline like we talked about. So this is, again, a Jenkins-based pipeline. Okay? It is set up for various phases. Okay? So this is what any developer would get. You get a service which is up and running. It has various phases. It has various tests. It actually does get deployed. It gets tested. It gets built, right, and gets run. Okay? And from a deployment perspective, I talked a little bit about what we use for deployment. So we use a tool called Argo. So Argo is one of our open source projects. And what a user typically ends up with is a service that is deployed. So if you're not familiar with Argo, this is what a deployment looks like. And it is a GitOps-based deployment, because as you can see, my service is synced. So it's actually synced to my Git repo. If I needed to make a change, I would go in there and change the deployment in Git. And this thing would appear as out of sync, and then I can sync it. And the running deployment will get synced to what's in my GitHub repo. Okay? So this is an open source tool. It's out there. Okay? And we'll talk more about it. But in a sense, what you ended up with a service, and you can see it's a service. You can see the deployment. You can see the ingress controllers. You can actually see how traffic is being routed. So here's your ALB. This is your ingress controller. Here are your running pods, and the traffic being routed to it. Okay? What you can do that's cool is I can go back and say, hey, I want to redeploy this. Or this is not working. Let me go back to a prior deployment. And I want to roll back to this particular version. When you roll back, again, fully automated, it'll go and redeploy the service that you had in Git. Okay? So that essentially tells you what a developer does. Right? Now, how do you manage these things? So along the way, we had to create, Kubernetes really doesn't have a multi-cluster management tool. We have 160 plus clusters in deployment. So we needed to create a tool, to manage these clusters. Okay? And this is what it looks like. So this is a view, a live view of all the production clusters that we have. The size denotes the size of the cluster. Okay. If I clicked on it, I would essentially get a look at what this cluster is doing. So this is a cluster Big circles are your namespaces. Individual pods running as the little green dots. If something was wrong, you would immediately see something. There's a health check here. And you see the health check that's going on for this particular cluster. Okay. So this is what a service operator, people that are managing these clusters, will look at. Okay. As a user, the only thing you care about is your particular namespace. So if I were to look at my namespace, this is what it looks like. Okay. It tells me what are my deployments, looks at my pods, what are my nodes, my ingresses. So this gives you an idea of what is actually going on in your particular namespace. Okay. You can go to health check. Again, it tells you whether your namespace or your application or your service is active. Okay. And going back into the cluster view, the way you manage a cluster, the really cool thing here is that we needed to actually upgrade these things. So all of the 160 clusters that you spoke about get upgraded every 2 weeks without the users getting a disruption to a running service in production. Right? And it's a one-click upgrade, uses the Kubernetes rolling deployment model, and upgrades the thing. Right? Okay. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what GitOps at scale would look like. Okay. Right. All right. With that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the open source projects that we've talked about. So Argo is an open source project that we have released. We started with Argo Workflows, which is heavily adopted by the ML and AI community now. Argo CD is something we needed to do actual deployments. And so that was the next thing that we deployed. And when we talked about progressive delivery, which Bob talked about, the biggest thing that we have at Intuit is that you need to run hundreds of experiments because we're making a lot of changes every day. So you need to have a mechanism by which you can roll out these experiments and see what the difference is between them. Very different from an A/B or a canary deployment. Right? And lastly, in the open source community, our friends at BlackRock actually saw a need where they wanted to actually trigger workflows based on specific events. So they ended up contributing the Argo Events project. Right? Okay. And today, as a community, the community has grown. It's been actually very satisfying. We have over 240 contributors. 60% of the contributions are coming in from the community. The last major release of Argo CD, 24 out of the 29 contributors were from outside Intuit, right? So a healthy, thriving community, and a lot of users. Okay. So these are our public references, meaning these users actually did submit a pull request to have their name added to the public repo. Some of the more prominent ones are, of course, BlackRock, who actually were the initial contributors to this project. Google. So if you're familiar with the Google Kubeflow project, the ML pipeline project, then Google Kubeflow is actually built on top of Argo Workflows. Ticketmaster, Tesla use Argo CD heavily in their environments. Okay. Which brings me to the next thing. So earlier this year, we started having discussions with the Flux CD team, right? Built at Weaveworks. They had approached this also from a different side. They were coming in from the bottom up because they needed something to manage clusters, and they needed to figure out how to actually roll out clusters at scale. We were coming at it from the service side, saying we need to make lives for our developers easier, right? And we saw an immediate, alignment and a need to bring these communities together, right? So this is what you may have seen from a news perspective. We're actually working hard to bring these projects together, to align the communities. And so we'd really love your feedback on this as we go along, and definitely contribute as well, right? I always say that I love feedback, but I love pull requests even more, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to now invite Alexis. Okay.